Welcome to Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and discuss some of humanity's most controversial and intriguing concepts through the lens of skepticism. We have with us today Richard Gilliver from the Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, and Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist. Today, we will be discussing apologetics. So, grab your English tea or your cafe macchiato with just a touch of chocolate drizzle, get comfy, and join us as we unpack all the different ways that people explain why they believe what they believe. So, gentlemen, who wants to start us off with what we've got going on?
Right. I'll do the usual announcements for Laura, which is, as usual, keep an eye out for her on the non-profits. She's a regular host on there. It's always so much fun. It's a roundtable discussion show. Find it on YouTube. Go and have a look at it if you've not seen it. If you have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's brilliant. Now let's talk about me.
Let's talk about you for a little bit.
I am so busy this week. It's unbelievable. Right, on May the 13th, I've got Ask an Atheist with Ethan Michael. It's just a new show he's got going where he just sits down with anybody who's an atheist, really. They don't have to be a content creator or anything, and just ask them a few questions, random questions. It's fantastic. On May the 14th, I've got a roundtable discussion with Ethan, Tangel Wright, Kenneth Leonard, yes, you are hearing me right, the Juggernauts, and Dragnaut, regarding a discussion that Ethan had about a guy who went from atheism to Islam. We're going to be reviewing that discussion that Ethan had, watching it, and just giving our opinions on it. And to top that week off for me, I've got the Bloody Good Film Podcast on May the 18th, which is it's a podcast about films that deals with action and horror films. And they asked me on to give a skeptic's eye over the exorcism of Emily Rose. So that's going to be a wonderful end of the week for me. So
that is fantastic. Be very tired. Very tired, but you're going to be very fulfilled because that's going to be a great lineup.
Certainly am. So yeah, well, that's it. Richard, I'm sure
Well, I was just going to say this week I'm planning on eating some meals. I may go to bed at some point, maybe get up again, some buses to catch. So look forward to that, everybody.
And would you be making any posts on any particular discussion forums on Facebook, Richard?
Potentially, because we have a jolly good Facebook discussion group, and there's a link to all of the places where you can catch us in the Linktree in the description. You can catch our show, and you're catching it somewhere now, but there are alternatives available to you. So you can see us in the flesh on YouTube, as well as on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, any other podcast apps that you take a fancy to, as well as then discussing stuff with us then on our Facebook discussion group. I've been loving it there recently. It's my little home away from home on the internet. And yeah, we just chat about stuff and open the conversation to everybody, and it's just a really fulfilling way of continuing the conversations that we have here. So yeah, please do go check that out if you haven't done so already, and I look forward to speaking to you there.
Fantastic. Okay, so remember, I'm from Unapologetically Me, so we're gonna take the un out of unapologetic, and we're gonna talk about apologetics. So which one of you wants to start us off on what apologetics even is? I know that's something that when I was religious, I took them for granted. And as an atheist, I was really confused about them for a long time. So
I had never heard of apologetics until leaving Christianity.
Right. Me neither. Yeah. So who wants, I think it goes to Gilliver then. Tell us a little bit about apologetics.
In general, apologetics is simply the defense of a proposition. It applies to any religion, really. It's most established, I think, probably in Christianity and Islam. Hinduism's got its fair share of apologetics as well, but in Christianity, you can go and study apologetics. You can actually go and study the arguments, study the responses, to defend your position, basically. And that's what apologetics is. It's the defending of the position, usually about a belief in God.
So then my question becomes, like, why is it called apologetics? Like, why is it apologetics when it's religion, but then it's just defending or explaining when it's any other belief? Like, what? So I always think of apologetics as meaning like apologizing, like, oh, sorry, we think this way because, or whatever. But really what it is defending. It's but there's a difference between defending a religious belief and then discussing or explaining, say, a scientific concept. So that's where, for me, apologetics gets really, really confusing. Is why
I think in terms of the word for that, because I think apologetics comes from like classical Greek, where it did have that generic meaning of defending an opinion or a view, like it was like a legal concept, I think. Whereas it's one of those words through time where some of those extra meanings have just fallen away, and the one that we've got nowadays is still the one that's there. That's my understanding in a basic sort of way.
It sounds really funny, doesn't it? Using the word apologetic, it, like Slova says, it sounds like they're apologizing for something. I'm so sorry. I'm terribly sorry. I have this belief in God.
Well, and then especially when you talk about, like, so apologetics is used most often when they're defending things like slavery in the Bible, or like in Islam, like Aisha and the young, her age when the Prophet Muhammad married her. So it does seem like there's sort of this weird aspect of apologizing to it. And so it kind of, and there's a way that it seems like the word is sort of justified, or it makes sense in terms of apologizing, but that's not really what it means, is it? Like, it doesn't really mean that at all.
And I've never heard an apologist speaks in an apologetic way. You know, they never sound like they're apologizing.
No. You're right. Go ahead.
It's developing arguments, isn't it? Really, that's what we're talking about. It's developing arguments so you can go out and explain to people why you believe in this God, give reasons, and it's largely a philosophical practice, and you find that across all, you know, as I said, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. You find that all of those people who are apologetics are at least somewhat versed in philosophy, or at least they think they are.
Or when you're trained to do apologetics, or when you test the waters and put your toes in to do apologetics, what you're doing is presenting arguments that sound philosophical. I think is almost a better. I know it's a less gracious way of putting it, but it really does seem like a lot of the people who do apologetics, they're not necessarily philosophers. They're not trained in philosophy, but they are trained in this sort of technique of how to approach the Bible that does, you're right, it mirrors philosophical debate and discussion.
I think even those who are trained in philosophy tend to, they certainly cherry pick what arguments they're going to use. There's so many, there isn't a consensus of a subject. You know, a lot of apologetics will focus on infinity, models of infinity, or things like that, where there isn't just one argument, but the way they present it. And we must remember that a lot of the time they're not talking to other people who know about philosophy. What they're doing in a lot of cases is trying to sell it to people who don't know about philosophy, trying to give them a convincing argument and say, you know, well, this makes sense. Listen to this argument. So they might give an opinion of infinity, which seems to defend the argument for God and seems to make sense. But what they don't tell you is that there are many, many different models of infinity. You know, there are philosophical models, there are mathematical models, there are physical models of infinity, and they're all different. And even within each kind of category, there are subcategories and different arguments amongst philosophers and different agreements and disagreements. And when apologists are talking about these things, they'll come along and they'll use an argument. They'll start with the conclusion of God, and they'll work their way backwards and find the particular model that fits into that argument and supports that argument, and they'll go out and they'll present it as though it's the only argument.
So in that sense, is apologetics, this is going to sound really kind of a little bit harsh, but in that sense, doesn't that make apologetics a little bit like a used car salesman, where you have like these I know it sounds terrible, but you have like these taglines, and they're taglines that are known to work with the broad population, and there are those select few that it's just not going to work for, and they're kind of taught to sort of spot those people and take either a different approach with those people, or don't take any approach at all with those people, and let those people sort of I don't know, like using the used car salesman analogy, when you get a really shrewd person who knows how to talk the talk, the used car salesman kind of pulls back and says, okay, you just tell me what you need and I'll give it to you. Oh, I can't provide you that. Sorry. Right. You're going to have to go to another car lot. And they just kind of shoo you along, or, oh, I can offer you this car. What do you think? Take it or leave it. And they stop using those kind of tactics altogether with you. Does that kind of have that kind of feel to you?
It does to me. I mean, the thing is, if you have a look at things like the cosmological argument, not taking any particular cosmological argument, but just in general, first cause arguments or cosmological arguments, which are basically, it's the idea that something must have caused the universe to exist. They've been going on since Plato and Aristotle, and they're still not solved. It's not like it's something that it's someone's come up with yesterday, and it's a groundbreaking argument, and it's going to convince everybody who has an understanding of philosophy because it's such a good argument. These have been going on for 2,500, 2,600 years, all across the world. It's not something that's just going to be solved like that. It's not that easy.
Not only is it not going to be solved, but it's never been entirely convincing, and it's always had holes in it, and the holes haven't been filled or plugged or explained. But, and this is where like the whole used car salesman thing comes in, it still convinces a lot of people. Right? People are still convinced by the cosmological arguments, despite and you really have to have a strong understanding of science and a strong understanding of philosophy together to really truly defeat that argument. Or you at least have to have heard the argument that defeats it and be well versed in it in order to defeat it. And so the average person just isn't. And so
before, haven't we, about how like lots of things like that as a sound bite sound, smooth and flawless and simple to understand. Yeah. So I think because sort of aside from the whole sort of big existential questions that apologists try and answer for people, I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one side of apologetics generally is like, what problems are there in this religious text, or what problems are there in this teaching that people could legitimately say, this is batshit, or how on earth was this right? And let's find a way to make it work with everything else that's going. Because like the Bible, for example, was written by countless authors over countless centuries, compiled together, scrambled together from various translations of this and that. And so there are, contradictions, and there are things which don't fit our modern sensibilities. And I think, again, if I'm right in thinking this, apologists often pick those things out and say, actually, you're misunderstanding it, and this is the right way of understanding this, or this is the way that you should be thinking about this, to try and, smooth over some of the slightly more rotten grapes in the punnet.
So that's
definitely. Sorry, go on, Laura.
I was just gonna say, that is, you just nailed, that's where apologetics is different from, say, just an explanation. Like, you can take a scientific explanation of, say, gravity and just explain it something. Oh, this is how gravity works. You don't know, and I'm going to tell you, and now you know. Where apologetics is different, and where it's nuanced, and where it needs that term apologetics, where other things don't, is where you have things like, oh, there's two lineages in the Bible for Jesus. And oh, by the way, they both go through Joseph, who isn't even biologically his dad. Yeah. Let's find a way to explain that to where it makes sense, to where God is still there and the Bible's still true, and it still perfectly makes sense if you look at it through this specific lens. Does that make sense?
Because it all starts from that position of, all of this is true, so we must find a way of explaining. Yeah, that like, there is no other possibility. This is true. God is real. The Bible is the word of God. the true word of God. So we need to find a way of making sure that all of this is explainable and is, explicable and reasonable sounding, even when it's not.
It can go down into nuances. I remember a conversation I had, and I'm not going to touch on the subject 'cause it's a trigger warning kind of subject, but it was based around translation, the conversation I had with him. And it was literally taking one word, the literal meaning of a single word, ignoring the entire context of the surrounding verses, just to try and apologize for this action that wasn't looked upon favorably and cast Christianity in a bad light. And the extent that some people will go to do that, to try and push forward that idea, is amazing. The length is just mind-boggling sometimes. The amount of cognitive dissonance that some people must have to do that, it bewilders me.
So I guess my question is, because they're using this tactic to convince others or to explain to others. My question is, like, does it work for them? Like when you explain, say, slavery or the creation story and let there be light and all that stuff, did they first have to convince themselves through this tactic?
It's like we could do that job, couldn't we? Like if someone tasked us with finding an argument that fits with this narrative, that fits with these presupposed ideas, like we could do that and come up with a reason and a rationale that fits all of those criteria. But it doesn't mean we're convinced of any of that stuff.
I guess that's my question is so you already believe in the Bible, you already believe in God, you already believe in Jesus and all that stuff. You've accepted him as your Lord and Savior. Great. Like you already have this foundation and you never questioned these things, or maybe you did and you found whatever the explanation was convincing. But now you have this apologetic. If you didn't believe and someone brought that apologetic to you, would that convince you? Like, is that what convinces you to believe? Or did you already just happen to believe and you've been told that this apologetic is useful or it works, so go ahead and just use this one? Like I'm genuinely curious about that because some of these arguments don't make any sense.
I've always been of the mind that I didn't think any of these arguments would convince anyone, and they were just using them after the fact that they believed. But I have been told by an apologist that one of these arguments did convince him, and that's what, like, I don't know whether he was an atheist and he went to Christianity or whether he's a Christian, and that's what like finally convinced him of the actual truth of God. But it was one of the cosmological arguments. So the way I previously thought is going on what he said has been shut out of the water. People are convinced by these things.
Yeah, but then so then the person giving the argument may or may not have been convinced by that particular argument, but the person who then starts to believe is based on that, and then they end up keeping in their own. I guess my question is when you're already Christian, you already believe. Would the argument work for you if you didn't believe? So I guess you're right. In some cases it would, and in some cases it wouldn't, because it does convince people.
But a lot of these arguments could be used effectively for just keeping people there. Like if you're a Christian, you believe in God, you believe the Bible's true, then you actually come across the passages in Exodus about slavery, and that suddenly becomes an issue for you because you're like, actually, this doesn't fit the narrative that I'm following. This doesn't seem to match with the morals that I've been taught and the ethics that I stand by. That's, I think, a really effective way where an apologist can sweep in and be like, actually, no, this is okay, and here's why. Continue along your way.
I think you're right, and I think that answers my question. I think both of you answered my question, and thank you. But I think you're right, because when I was Christian and I had these questions, that was exactly what happened. Was I would say, look, I don't understand how you could read the New Testament and get that Jesus was God. Like, I don't get it in there. And that is exactly what was presented to me, was these apologetics. Like, well, here's how it works, and here's all the cogs, and fit them all together and put all these pieces together. And here, just take it and believe it, right? And so it didn't work for me, but I think you're right. I think in a lot of cases with a lot of Christians, when they do hit those stopping points or those stumbling blocks, someone sweeps in and they have this beautiful, perfect, elaborate, intricate argument, and it sweeps them back into belief I mean, for me, the opposite happened, and that's why I'm kind of curious. But um, but I think you're right. I think that a lot of times apologetics is not just used to bring in new people, but it's used to convince questioners in that same vein.
I'd be very interested to see the ratio of people, because I know a lot of people who are atheists now, who I've talked to, who have said that, yeah, it was reading the Bible, and even a lot of scholars on the subject who are atheist scholars have said, I went into this thing, I was fully convinced, I was fully committed to believing in God and to Jesus. And it wasn't until I started studying the Bible and reading the
Yes.
Bible that I actually became atheist. So I'd be interested to see the ratio of people who were genuinely questioning and those who came out of religion compared to those who were convinced to go into religion by it. I've no idea of those figures, but that'd be really interesting
That
to
would be
find that out.
quite a study. I don't even know how you would do it, but that would be
I don't know.
fascinating to know. Because you're right, like that, I was so convinced of God and Christianity and stuff. And you're right, the more I asked questions, the more I studied, the less convinced I became. And then apologetics happened the opposite for me for Islam, where they got me into Islam. But then the more, again, I think they worked both ways for me in Islam. They got me into Islam because they answered the questions that I had for Christianity. And the apologetics worked beautifully to convince me, oh no, that makes sense. That sounds beautiful. That argument sounds great. And then again, you stew on it for a while, it simmers, you let your brain kind
I
of
think
on
you've
it. It makes
described
less
as well,
sense.
Laura, haven't you, about how that transition for you into Islam was because the things about Christianity didn't make sense, and a lot of the apologetics in Islam are counter-Christian. So it's like, here's why
Absolutely.
Christianity is wrong and why Islam is right. And I guess they saw you come in. They were like, this is a good one to target.
I don't even think that. So the chaplain that convinced me wasn't even specifically targeting me. I targeted myself. I heard what he was saying, and I was like, "You, I need to talk to you. You come here. We're gonna talk. You, me, we're gonna sit down. We're gonna have a conversation." And he was actually very hesitant. Like he's like, "I don't want to shake your faith. I don't want to cause any problems." But yeah, I think the argument though is you're right. It's targeted to people exactly like me. And I think there's a good reason for it. Like, so Christians want to get non-Christians, but the majority, like a third of the people on the planet are Christians, ish. So they're gonna target multiple things, including atheism. But you're right, other religions are gonna worry less about atheists, which are a very, 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 very small part of the population, and they're gonna worry a heck of a lot more about Christians, who are the majority on this planet right now, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense.
If you're in number 2, target the people at number 1.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting as well, talking about Islam. I know we've discussed this at some length before, so I'll just kind of skim over it here. But it's interesting how in Islam they tend to target Christians rather than atheists, whereas in Christianity they tend to target atheists, and Hinduism they just tend to target everybody.
And is there, so I haven't really been exposed to, I've been exposed to Hindus who are willing to talk about their beliefs and share them, but I've never been exposed to Hindu apologetics that are designed to,
it's
I've never
painful.
heard it. That's honestly, that just shows my own ignorance, because I'll go out to YouTube and I'll look for Christian content, I'll look for Muslim content, because that's where my passions are and stuff. And while I love learning about Buddhism and Hinduism and stuff, it just isn't as relevant to my personal life, my personal experience. So it just shows, like, when it comes to apologetics, like I have been well exposed to Christian apologetics and well exposed to Muslim, and I have not been at all exposed to, like, I've gone to Buddhist temples and I have watched their services and stuff, and I've asked questions, and I've done research, but it was always me going to them, right? I've never been exposed to apologetics outside of those two religions. It's interesting.
Richard, you look like you had something to say then.
No.
Right. Well, I just want to make a quick distinction on that point then,
Yeah.
while you think of something to say. When I'm talking about Hinduism, I'm not talking about Buddhism as such.
No, I didn't mean to make them sound synonymous. Those were just two in my head.
I've never experienced any Buddhists going out to try and convince anybody, or I don't think I know of any apologetic arguments from Buddhism. at all, really. So it is more from the Hindu side of thing, which is an entirely different religion, although you may not know. So you may not think so from an outsider looking in.
No, so yeah, just to clarify before you go on, because you're right. The reason I brought Buddhism into it is because that is a religion that I've sought out information on, and
Right,
I've gone to them. So that, like, I haven't done that with other religions, and I have with Buddhism. So I wasn't trying to connect Buddhism with Hinduism. I was more trying to connect my experience with other religions and not getting that sense of apologetics.
Yeah,
But going back to what you said, no, I just want to make that clarification. But it's good that you brought that up, because that's a really easy mistake to make, is to like kind of link the two of them together. But I'm really interested in what you have to say about Hindu apologetics, because that I've never heard that. I want to know what your exposure to that is.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of exposure through Hare Krishnas, who were a branch of Hinduism that was brought, and I'm not sure it was brought to the West. I think it was started by a guy called Preela Prabhupada, I think, or something along them lines. So in the 50s or 60s, went to America, and it was kind of on his last legs. I think he had a couple of heart attacks on the way over, and he started the movement, the Hare Krishna movement there. And I think, like a lot of the Eastern movements that kind of took off in the West, I think it was kind of I don't want to say splinter so much movement, but it kind of got its own interpretation of the overall religion. And you see that in Buddhism as well, when a lot of Buddhist teachers at the same time in the 50s and the 60s came into the West, and they had their own unique interpretation, and it kind of took off from there in the West and became a Western movement. But that's mainly my exposure through Hare Krishnas. And of course, in the 60s, they had a huge kind of push because the Beatles got into all that kind of stuff. And George Harrison, especially, I think, funded one of the Hare Krishna temples in the UK, the main Hare Krishna temple in the UK. So they had a real kind of push for the movement. But going to the apologetics, they will talk about the number of, I don't remember the word they use. I want to say kalpas, but that's the Buddhist term, and I don't know if it's used in Hinduism. But the length of time that they say a universal cycle lasts is exactly 13.8 billion years.
Oh, very convenient.
But it's one of those things where it's kind of cherry picked, and they have different lengths of time.
And if we readjust our understanding of the universe, if that timeline changes based on new mathematical data, then now all of a sudden they have this link to scripture that's no longer valid.
And another thing with it is that what they don't mention when they're trying to push this apologetic is that in Hinduism, the universe is cyclical. Mm-hmm. So Alan Watts described Hinduism. There's best description, because Hinduism is very fragmented. There are bits of this and bits of that, and you can speak to one part of it which is entirely different to another part of it. Alan Watts gave a very general I think it was Alan Watts gave a very general description of Hinduism overall, and he said it's basically, the gist of Hinduism is that God plays a massive game of hide and seek with himself.
I've heard that before.
And it breathes out, it causes the universe. Each one of us as individuals are sparks of God. Our souls are God, but we just don't remember that we're God.
And we're not fully God, we're a part of God, right? Like
we are part of God.
Right. Yeah, so we're like analogous to maybe like a cell.
We're like a spark coming off a fire.
Okay.
But we forget this through ignorance and things. So, and then what happens is the universe comes into being. God starts playing this big game of hide and seek with himself. When he comes back to himself, and everybody's realizes that's the end of the universe, and then the cycle starts over again. So that's a general kind of outline, which I'm sure some people will pick apart, but as I say, it's supposed to be a very general one.
But it's an example of a Hindu apologetic.
It's
I appreciate
it's an example of an Hindu apologetic, because they will say that the length of time the universe has been is exactly what it says, but they ignore the cyclical nature of it to a large extent because they're trying to fit it into the science.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to say. Is the main thing with
jumping on those
apologetics.
aspects of science, it's one of those things that makes things sound more feasible, makes things more feasible, and all of that, isn't it?
One of the things I'm interested in doing as a brief aside is that I want to go into, and I've not had a chance to do this yet, I want to go and have a look into these periods of time to see if, because I know somebody's wrote a book, and I don't remember the guy's name, it's wrote a book of Hindu apologetics. And I'll put the link in the description when we air the episode, but he's wrote this book of Hindu apologetics, and I'm really interested to see if he's kind of used one school of Hinduism or one school of Hindu thought to write the entire book to try and fit it into like science, or whether he's plucked a little bit from this part of Hinduism and a little bit from this part of Hinduism and a little bit to try and fit it all together to make it more presentable. But I don't know that. That's just something I want to have a look into myself. But yeah, they certainly have a vast amount of apologetics.
Okay, so I want to respond to what you were saying about Hinduism being so fractured, right? And having like, well, is this apologetic for all of Hinduism or just this one fracture of Hinduism or bits and pieces here and there? One thing with apologetics and just with religion in general that I think a lot of people take for granted is that every religion is like that. Like I went into Christianity thinking like, yeah, sure, I know there's these different churches and like Baptist and Lutheran and all that. And I don't really understand the differences. They're all basically the same. And then the more and more and more you learn about it, the more they're not even close to the same in some cases. And they're actually like mutually exclusive in some cases, where if one wants to claim that they're right, it means that these other ones are actually wrong. And so there's no one specific Christian belief that like it's overarching for all of them.
It's almost like some parts of Christianity are like separate religions, like altogether.
Yeah, I mean, it's really obvious when you talk about, like, say, Mormonism, right? Like, it's really easy for other Christians to be like, well, they're not, like the whole no true Scotsman fallacy.
Yeah.
Whereas they would say, no, we are Christians. We just have this additional little bit that we understand that you guys don't accept. And that's fine. You guys don't have to accept it. We're all Christians. We're all good. But from the outside perspective, it's really easy to not call them Christians. But then there's these other churches where it's harder to see where that nuance is. And it's harder to see that they're mutually exclusive. But I just wanted to point out that sort of, so when it comes to apologetics, Christianity has that, Islam even has that. When I went into Islam, I thought, oh, cool, one religion, one teaching, one book, one interpretation. Got this. This is perfect. And then the more and more I start learning, the more, oh, no, it was very fractured very early on. In fact, it started out fractured with who takes over after Muhammad dies. Boom, right off the bat, there was a fracture. And it's been like that ever since. And then even within the Sunni and the Shiite teachings, that even more fracturing, just like Christianity.
Since our Islam episode, I've done loads of Googling about that, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, since our episode, I've also learned that I need to go back and relearn a lot of the stuff that I've forgotten. But anyway, I'm almost tickled and excited to learn that it's the same with Hinduism. And I've already learned that it's the same in Buddhism, in studying that in my cultural anthropology. So that is something that when it comes to apologetics, it's interesting to me because you're trying to defend a belief, but what specific belief are you trying to defend? Like there is no, this is the Christian belief and this is the Muslim belief. So that just brings up a whole nother level of exploration.
I think a lot of the apologetic arguments in the I don't know about Judaism. I've not, bizarrely as it sounds, the amount of study I've done into this kind of stuff, and I've not really studied Judaism that much apart from as a precursor to Christianity.
I don't know Judaism in this conversation at all until you said it. Just interesting.
I think it's because like Buddhism, don't they not have a lot of apologetics? Like they'll answer questions when people ask, but they don't seem to have that same high level of I'm gonna. And maybe in some cases they do, and I'm just taking that for granted. But I just haven't noticed that Judaism has as strong of a need to convert and to explain. They're more like, if you don't get it, you don't get it, and it's all good.
They are a single entity, though, aren't they? I mean, it's very, very hard to become a Jew, and even when you become a Jew, you're not a proper Jew if you're not. Whereas the Christianity and Islam are actively going out to convert people, to bring them into the fold. So I think that may be one of the reasons, at least, why. But a lot of the arguments between that Islam has and the Christianity has, the apologetic arguments, are the same arguments. They're not specific to that religion or a sect of that religion. So I think
like generic God arguments, like you were talking about cosmological arguments and stuff, that doesn't get you, we've said before, it doesn't get you to any specific belief about anything, really. It's just getting you to accept a generic idea about stuff.
Well, so that brings up a good point about that specific apologetic is if we're just talking philosophically and you want to have a philosophical discussion with me, I would be perfectly willing for the purpose of that discussion to say, okay, I will grant you the cosmological argument. I'll grant you that.
See, I'm not.
Just for the purpose of discussion. Do I buy it? No. Do I buy into it? No. But if you want to sit down and have a conversation with me about your worldview and you want to say like, okay, well, we don't know whether or not there's a creator. So let's just start for the purpose of discussion with the cosmological argument. I'll say like, fine, let's do that. Let's go from there. Let's have this conversation. Ultimately,
I would have been at one time, but I've got to the point.
You're so shrewd now, Richard. Yeah,
it's not that I'm shrewd. It's just the fact that I've had specifically the Kalam cosmological argument. I've had that conversation. God, must have been hundreds of times, and I've just got to the point where I'm not interested in even granting them the thing. If you can't, the fact is that Kalam cosmological argument says that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and we don't know that.
We don't, and that's true. But there are sometimes where, like the everyday person, I just don't want to break that down every single time with them. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, I mean, like you're right that premise one has an issue. In fact, all the premises have different issues, right? But sometimes it's just not worth the energy to break it apart with people, and I'm okay with that, and I'm at ease with that. Like, hey, let's have this discussion. I want to see where it goes.
Because that argument doesn't actually lead anywhere specific. You can then
they expect you to grant it. Yeah. But that's what they're wanting to do.
Right. That is where it enter my issue with where I will draw the line is what Gil was saying, where that doesn't get you to any specific God. So I will say, hey, for the purpose of this discussion, let's grant for now the cosmological argument, just for the fuck of it, just to see where it goes. Get me to a Christian God. Get me to a Muslim God. Get me to the Hindu, like the main God. Because from my understanding of Hinduism, it's like there's a main God who fractures and he's all the other different gods, but they're all him, but they're not. They are. Okay, so that's a one God kind of thing. Get me to the point in that argument where you can say, therefore, this belief is justified or that belief is justified. And that is where I like to take the cosmological argument is, okay, fine, let's grant it for now. Get me to your God, because you can't. Right? There's no way to get to the
they can
characteristics. Well, there's always like leapfrogging and but that's where that's where I want to have the conversation, right? All this leapfrogging and all this apologetics, right?
And with all of this,
exactly,
part of my thinking with all of it, and I'm going to move away from this slightly and then come back to it, is like, I always feel, and one of the big things that sort of led me out of Christianity was this question of like, why isn't God more obvious? Like, and I know this doesn't sound like it's related, but it is. Like, why isn't God more obvious? And why aren't all of these messages much more simple? You know, like this question of like having to interpret texts and to have all these different ways of understanding stuff and the arguments that go with that, to me, all added up to proof more than anything that it was less likely to be true. Proof that something's less likely. That doesn't even make sense as an idea, but you get what I'm saying. Like the fact that things are complicated and hidden and difficult to understand and require interpretation don't add up to an omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent God,
right?
Because that sort of God would make it really clear and easy. Why would it be hard?
Unless that God was also tricky, which then it questions the omnibenevolent side of it.
Yeah.
But
then it makes me think with these apologetics and stuff, which are really diving deep into some of these things to really wrangle out of this pile of shit that's on the floor, the sort of good bits that make some sort of sense. That to me, as a coming out of Christianity and moving towards atheism, sort of, yeah, added on to that as well, in terms of like, if we need this at all as a field of study that people dedicate their lives to in order to explain these things, sure, that is just a reason to think maybe this isn't true.
I mean, that's how I felt. Yeah, that's how I totally felt the whole time I was religious, that if there's a God, then that God is obvious in this reality, and that God would make himself known in this reality. And if this God is good, and I'm seeking this God, then this God will make themselves apparent to me, regardless of my skepticism, regardless of my questions. Any question I should ask and any challenge I should issue should really just justify that this God exists, right?
And skepticism should be from where I stood, skepticism should be a bonus point for me in terms of like a God wanting to show themselves to me. Like, I'm being skeptical and I'm wanting to seek this out, but I'm thinking about it in this way. I'm being honest and true to myself, and not just blindly accepting things without thinking them through. So sure, that's a point in my favor in trying to seek out a God. But yeah,
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the very fact that they have to come up with these arguments, and let's not forget the length of time they've been coming up with these arguments. Like we said, Plato and Aristotle came up with first cause argument like thousands of years ago. And then you've got like argument from contingency, which were Leibniz, I think, who came up with that one. That's that there has to be something rather than nothing, and necessary being must exist. And then you've got like around the first millennium, you had St. Anselm who were coming up with a priori arguments. And these have been going on. They've been thinking of new arguments and refining the old arguments for so long that you'd think by now, if they were good arguments, they would be settled in stone, and everybody would be looking at them like they look at the evidence for evolution or gravity and saying, you know what, this is just self-explanatory. There shouldn't be an argument about it.
Yeah, so I just want to piggyback on that and say exactly what you said, but in a different way, because I think, and I mean, not because you didn't say it well, but because I think that this is a really important point to drive home, and driving it home in two different ways is important. So
and I tend to rattle a lot.
Yeah. No, I think you made the point really well, but it was like, it was spurning all this thought in my brain. And so I just really felt like I wanted to make the point as well, that if you have a model that works with reality, it works with reality, period. It fits, it clicks, it works. So when you have a Bible or the Quran or any of these religious texts, that if they were absolutely true in reality, not in your heart, not in your head, not that I feel that it's true, but if literally these things are true, then they should fit with reality and what we see as being true. It should be a model that is consistent and is fluid, and it works back and forth with each other. Science works with religion, religion works with science. What you end up having actually is this butting of heads. And the only way that religion ends up ever fitting with science is when it acquiesces to science, and not the other way around. Does that make sense? So when the religion adjusts and says, like, you have Christians that say, oh no, millions of years, great, got it, I'm good. And Christians who say, yeah, like evolution was the way that God worked, right? And so they accept the scientific side and they morph their religion to fit it, rather than, oh, you know what? Like religion and science already work together to begin with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it goes as well to what we were saying about the presupposed ideas about it already being true. So it's like, simple historical things in the Bible that have not really anything to do with like God and the theological side of what's in there, but details about civilizations or towns or battles or movements of people or genealogies and things like that, where historians have since found evidence to the contrary. That's where apologetics jumps in to try and bridge that gap. Well, no, it makes sense because of this and this and this. And again, like you were saying, like if the Bible was true, and again, the Bible specifically as an example, if the Bible was true, we wouldn't need to have someone to argue the fact that this is true despite historical evidence of the contrary, because there would be no historical evidence to the contrary. Because
yeah, exactly. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just agreeing with you.
No. I finished.
You had my enthusiastic agreement. Yeah. So the consistency and the weaving together, not just between science but with history, it's just, you're right. It's just not there, and we wouldn't. I guess that's the point I was trying to make. Is if, and I think you guys are trying to make it too. If these texts are true, you don't need apologetics.
We shouldn't need it.
We'd call it history. We'd call it science. We'd call it reality, and we wouldn't have a word for it, apologetics, that separates it from these concepts.
And to push that point a little further, that's taking just apologetics out of the context for a second. Just generally talking about epistemology, these are the conversations I have with people. That's exactly the method I use to discuss epistemology with people, to point out that maybe there's a better way of thinking, is that we have a shared reality. Everybody can agree on our shared reality. To an extent, to as maximal as possible extent. And then you get these arguments which are just layered on top. And that to me is the kind of core of skepticism. You start with this base layer of reality and ask, why have we got this thing on top, and go into it and investigate it. And I think that's the same, that's just an extension of what we've been talking about with that apologetics argument, is that they kind of add stuff on top of what's shared by everyone, and it doesn't make sense.
So I agree with you, but I think that this is where apologetics gets really tricky, and this is where they use sort of our own arguments against us. And where apologetics has a good point is the pointing out that not everybody agrees on everything, that there is a lot of stuff that is still contested. And so they'll use things like Big Bang Theory, where we really don't know what happened before like minute 0 or second 0 or whatever you want to call it, t=0. We don't know what happened before the Big Bang. We don't know exactly what catalyzed it and what caused it and how it all happened. And so they'll take those insecurities or those little discrepancies and the arguments that scientists still have over these particular things, and they'll turn it into an overall blanket, like, well, because we still have questions, this is where my apologetics comes in, or this is why your position is just as rocky as mine and requires just as much apologetics. So there has to be that nuanced discussion of, okay, we're exploring reality and we're doing it in such a way that we are correcting ourselves as we go, but we need to be more honest about being explicit about what we don't know. Instead of saying, oh, Big Bang, boom, there you go, it's the Big Bang versus religion. Instead of doing that, having that nuanced discussion of what we do and don't know about it, but also recognizing that we don't all have the same understanding. And so do you see what I'm saying? Like,
no, I understand exactly. And that's the gap they try and squeeze God in. Exactly. When I was talking about having a shared reality, I mean that we can all agree that the sky is blue, or
but that's it. So an apologetic person would say, but that's the point I'm trying to make. So an apologist would say, we don't all say that the sky is blue. There's a consensus, but there's colorblind people, or there's totally blind people, or is it blue to a dog? And so they take what actually you're making a good point.
Yeah.
But there's a nuance there that we have to be careful about, because that's where the apologist uses our points against us, right? So we have to be careful, because how would, if an apologist said, yeah, not everybody says the sky is blue, how would you approach that, right? We have to be ready for it.
Because it could be like color's just a concept that we've come up with, because nothing is a color. It's just a way we've come up with of describing how our brain processes certain light frequencies. Like color doesn't exist.
Right.
I think like using analogies of things, it's like, so we had some hobnobs in the kitchen a couple of weeks ago, and I knew that the packet hadn't been opened, but then I went into the kitchen and there were 2 missing from the pack. I knew that my son Freddie had been in there. He's 4, and I said to him, "Have you eaten any of the hobnobs?" And he said no. So this is that thing of like the Bible saying something, but historical evidence saying something else. So Freddie said to me, "No, I haven't eaten any, but I can see that they've been eaten." And so that's when we get all the things of like, well, the window's open, maybe a cat came in. We've got the whole thing of like maybe someone else ate them. We've got the, and that's exactly how I see this whole thing of like, yeah, if I'm expecting the packet not to be open and I go in the kitchen and they're still not open, job done.
Conversation over.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I use the term maximal rather than certain, because we can't have certain knowledge about anything.
Yeah.
Right, and we can answer that question. It just makes it complex.
My children eat hobnobs. That's one certainty.
I had the exact same conversation with my son over. We got some Chips Ahoy brownie cookies, like where it's the brownie in the middle of the Chips Ahoy, and I knew that there was a significant amount missing, and that only like my husband and I hadn't had any cookies yet. Right, we gave Amber 2, and then we told her to go give 2 to him, and I went and asked him, "Have you had your cookies yet?" And he's like, "No." I'm like, "Yes, you have. You've had your cookies." And he's like, "How did you know? How did you know?" I'm like, "Because I can look at the package and there's this many missing and she only had 2." It's like there are explanations. They just become drawn out and complicated, and now you have to stop. And
the cat coming in the window is a thing that possibly physically could have happened. Like a cat could have come in the window and could have specifically
opened the package.
Like it's not outside the realms of possibility. It's just Freddy eating them is what happened.
It's just this. It's Occam's razor at that point, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's where skepticism comes in for people like us, isn't it? To not take on those beliefs until there is evidence for it. You wouldn't suspect the cat coming in the window if the window was open just a little bit and your child is sat there with cookie crumbs around his mouth. You don't suddenly jump to, well, what about this other explanation? Even if you're not 100% sure about the outcome. But this is what I think what some apologists exploit in us, the fact that we are willing to say, I don't know. And the fact that we are willing to say that that's what gives them the opening to jump in and say, well, if you're not certain, then what about this?
Not just that they're willing to exploit that with those of us who are willing to say, I don't know, but they're also willing to do the opposite, where they're willing to capitalize on the fact that people don't want to say, I don't know. They want the answers. Yeah. And so if you can give them an answer that is satisfying and that pleases them, it goes back to like when I was a Christian and I had these questions, they gave me an answer that was supposed to just satisfy me. And it was supposed to just be okay. Yeah. Right. And so if you could just satisfy a person's need to know, then the actual argument, when you pick it apart, say academically or scientifically, it doesn't have to hold weight there. It has to hold weight on the level of what is the average person going to just accept because it sounds good. Right. And I know that we make mistakes in other ways besides religious, with accepting things as true that aren't true. Right. So it's not all on religion and it's not all on apologists. It's a human nature thing. But I think apologetics specifically works to that weakness in us.
It's kind of the magician of religion, isn't it? They know the trickiness, but they're quite happy to do so.
But I think that does come back to Laura, your question of like, do apologists, stand by the apologetics that they come up with? And I know there are lots of apologists who, it's their livelihood, isn't it? Like it's their living. They make, their whole way of life is based on the fact that they earn money from writing books and doing talks. And
look at William Lane Craig. He wrote the Cosmological Argument in 1977.
And
that was the year I was born.
Yeah, he'll defend it tooth and nail.
Yeah, and that's he'll modify it when he's put in a corner, but when he's not put in a corner, he'll always return to the original thing. And that's been going on for 43 years. And that's his livelihood. That is how he's made his name. Literally, how he's made his name.
Mm-hmm. Is that one argument? Yeah, that one.
Bless him, because like 2 weeks after he first said all that stuff and wrote the book, someone was like, "Have you not thought about this?" It's like, "Oh shit!" But I'm back in this hole now.
But I've sold the books and I've put my reputation on the line. I don't know. And that's kind of impossible to say, right? Is like how much of apologetics is just digging your heels in because you feel like you have to, and how much of it is just real, genuine belief. but putting that aside, oh my gosh, you made a point and it was so good, and I was going to respond to it, and then
Me?
wow, I can't remember which one of
Well, it
you.
wasn't me if it was a good one.
Well, then we can just move on because I honestly can't remember. It was really good, but and it was about the William Lane Craig argument. And if it comes back to me, I'll come back around to it if I remember. But in the meantime, we can move on to a different subject and kind of move on from that, or not. Don't put it
Oh,
on.
was that an opening to do so?
It is, because I lost my point, and now I need you guys to generate somewhere to go. And well, I try.
Well, we can
to hold
talk
on to my
about some
point.
of the arguments.
Well, I think
Some of
I
the
was just wanting to say, sort of on the back of what we were talking about then, like we were saying it's impossible to know whether the apologists always stand behind the arguments they make and stuff. And I think we've possibly presented apologists throughout a conversation generally as being people who are trying to scramble at straws. Again, mixing my metaphors. Being like trying to frantically find a way of justifying these things, whereas there are probably apologists who just legitimately are trying to justify their things in a really honest and intellectually honest way as well. But obviously, it just has that effect of then trying to convince people or keep people within a religion when they've got these questions and stuff like that. So, yeah, I was just thinking about how we'd sort of represented apologists.
Yeah, so I kind of want to agree with you on that. Like that might be a misrepresentation, because I do think a lot of these apologetics, they are deeply thought of. They are things that people have pondered for a long time, or people have really considered and really tossed around in their heads. I think the difference is, like, apologetics, they do make some really good sounding arguments, and so I think that once the person does become convinced of that, that it's just kind of an argument that stays, and it has power in it, and it takes on, sort of like a steam train, it takes on speed and it's hard to stop. But that is a really good point, is that they're not just grasping at straws, as you were trying to say. They, I think there is some deep thought and some deep reflection that goes into these apologetics. I think what is missing is the scrutiny in the scientific process and the desire to want to test that claim once they're convinced of it and once it makes sense. Like, it's almost like, I don't want to know whether or not it holds water because I want to hang on to it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that you're right to criticize us there, and or at least make that distinction that it's not just people just making shit up to try and fill in blanks. There is a level of really deep thought that goes into some of these.
Right. Some of the best philosophers in history have been thought these arguments up, so they're certainly not just the cereal back of the cereal packet kind of things.
Right. Yeah.
Going back off what you were saying, Laura, on outside of the realms of apologetics, though, is we have these conversations completely unplanned and unprepared. But one thing I do need to prepare is a list of go-to metaphors that I can use in conversation.
No, I kind of like it this way. It reminds me of that guy from Short Circuit, where he's like, piece of pie, right? And he gets every single metaphor, he gets it, or every single what do you call that linguistic thing? I guess metaphor. Gets every single one of them wrong. We'll have to play a clip sometime.
Well, as long as it comes off as endearing, then I'm fine.
And it's a little bit of comic relief. I like it. Okay, so apologetics. One thing that we haven't touched on yet is, like, okay, so we've touched on like what apologetics is compared to science and stuff like that. But what is our skeptical view on apologetics? Like, when you talk about apologetics, there's a distinction to be made between, like we were saying, between science and history and apologetics. But does that automatically mean that we should just dismiss everything they say as skeptics? Like, oh, that's just an apologetic tactic. I can dismiss that because it's apologetics. This is a leading question. So I think I have an answer to it, but is that something that you think that we should do?
I don't think we should dismiss everything they say just because it's apologetics, because that doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong. And as we've said, some of the arguments are, there's nothing wrong with the arguments themselves in the way they're formed. It's the leaps they take to get to the conclusion. For example, the cosmological argument its premises are sound and everything. There's nothing. It doesn't fail in its construction. It's the way it's applied that fails. And it's because we don't have all the answers scientifically, coming back to the skeptical part of the question, it's because we don't have all the answers scientifically, and we have to stop, if we're honest, and say, I don't know, that's exploited.
Because there are gaps to fill, legitimate gaps.
Yeah.
That are then filled. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think that in addition to that, I don't think that all apologetics are necessarily wrong. Like, I do think that there are some misunderstandings about any religion, be it Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, that apologetics are rightly addressing, right? So there are apologetics out there for Islam, for example, about the hijab, where I've heard Muslim women apologize that no, we don't have to wear it. It's our expression to be closer to God and to be more like to emulate the wives of Muhammad. And if you had asked me when I was a Muslim why I wear hijab, that would have been the answer I gave. It wasn't because I'm ordered to, because I have to, or because it's compulsive, but because I want to set myself apart as a Muslim. And so that when people are walking around, they say, that woman cares about God, right? That woman has a belief and she's sticking to it. And so that specific apologetic and others like it, they're right criticisms. They're good apologetics, right? So
in some cases.
In some cases, but that's why I asked the question, because we were talking an awful lot about how all these apologetics are wrong, and they're anti-scientific. But some apologetics are taking misconceptions about those religions or about those teachings, and they are rightfully addressing them in ways that are true.
I think it's hard as well because a lot of the things that I talked before about how all of these things should be simple and straightforward and easy to understand if God is all of the things that I mentioned. But like, I think because a lot of the big questions are so complicated that when apologists who, like you said, Laura, earlier on, definitely have spent a long time studying, preparing, and undertaking research into, other scholarly sources or whatever into these things, when they present an argument in a way that sounds not only authoritative but sufficiently sort of intellectually built up, like it sounds solid and sounds researched and sounds all this, that because most people don't consider these questions in that sort of detail, even just the fact that it comes from someone who is speaking authoritatively is enough to sort of convince people that that's possibly true. Yeah, I think that was the point I was making.
Well, and sometimes the apologetics are researched and thought about and put through academic lenses. They're just missing like certain aspects of either scrutiny or critical thinking. Yeah, so sometimes like my dad is really into like the archaeological Bible, where it describes how the Bible is true archaeologically, and it has all these references and all these maps, and it's very studious and it's very academic and it's very deep. Not a lot of people would want to read a Bible like that. But he loves it because it's so well thought out and so well researched. What it's missing is that the general consensus, like when you go to that specific archaeological spot, do scientists and archaeologists and historians actually think that that's the spot that you're saying it is, or is that spot given other well, we don't really think it's that, and here's why, right? And so that's what's missing. But you're right. I think that one thing we need to be clear about is sometimes there is a lot of research and thought put into this. There are just key pieces missing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that actually, do you guys have anything? I mean, we're getting up at time, so we could just wrap it now. What are your guys' final thoughts?
Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to reiterate what we said before in terms of like, my general view of it is that its existence proves its futility. That sounded like a sophisticated sentence.
I think you need to put that as one of the quotes for this week's episode. That needs to go up on a meme.
Yeah, it's because it exists. It kind of goes against what I'll stop talking because I can't say anything as eloquent as I've just said. So its existence proves its futility. Jillifer.
I think we've concentrated a lot on the philosophical arguments tonight. I think Laura touched on a good point, which would have been lovely to expand on if we'd have had a little bit more time, of the fact that not all apologetics is philosophical. Some of it's just about like explaining, as we said at the top of the show when we were talking about what it was. Some of it is just explaining a position, and some of those positions are legitimate, and that would have been a lovely route to go down. But as far as the philosophical ones go, we've got to apply, I think, skepticism at every kind of level and be willing to say, even if it leaves us open to apologists coming in and trying to take advantage, if that's what they're going to do, we've got to be willing to say, I don't know. It's the same thing we say every week, virtually. Got to be willing to say, I don't know. We don't have that information. We'll just leave it there until further evidence comes along that we can be convinced by.
Yeah, and I think it would be kind of fascinating to do a whole other episode on this in the future where we do, like, I mean, we're just supposed to be discussing these things like through the lens of skepticism and whatever we want to say, we say. But I think having a focus where what are some of the apologetics and what different subjects do they touch? Is it historical? Is it scientific? Is it emotional? What are they what are they touching on and what are they trying to do? Not necessarily to disprove them, but just to discuss them. Like what different.
We've been talking in lots of abstract ways, I guess, today, haven't we?
Yeah.
Whereas to look at some of those concrete things and sort of investigate them would be a good thing. I'll pop it on the spreadsheet.
Yeah, and how we feel about it and how we approach it or analyze it or whatever. I think that'd be really great. But we are at time, so we're gonna save that for a whole nother episode, and we're gonna wrap it up here. So thank you all for joining us today. I think it was a really great discussion, and obviously it left room for a lot more discussion in the future because that's exactly what we're talking about. So we will see you all later. In the meantime, we are Laura.
Richard.
And Richard. And this is Skeptic Hangout. Until next time.
Keep questioning.
Interrogate your beliefs.
And stay skeptical. Goodbye.
Bye.